Hello everyone, Vengeance5714 here. Some of you may know me by my actual name, which is Jake, and in today's video we have plans to cover the 1980s as a decade. This project is a history project, and it was a surprisingly long undertaking, albeit some of the time was wasted to procrastination. The idea of the project was to create a PowerPoint covering 10 events and histories from the 1980s. The definition of history is 1. The study of past events, particularly in human affairs, the past considered as a whole. 2. The whole series of past events connected with someone or something. And 3. A continuous, typically chronological record of important or public events or of a particular trend or institution. By this definition, I am covering the events of the 1980s as recollected by my family members. These are moments in their lives where they have been impacted forever, hence why they remember it 40 years later. I have to give credit to my dad for helping with research and providing some media for this project. I definitely have to give credit to my grandparents for helping with some of the trivia involved as well. So let's get into it. How about we start with technology? In no particular order, the 1980s are responsible for the modernization of personal computers. My grandparents had a TRS-80, which stands for Tandy Radio Shack, to which my grandparents both operated a Radio Shack before. The Model 3 released in the 80s and was discontinued soon after due to an updated policy on electromagnetic interference. One of the final updates to its software before its discontinuation was a note stating, "Joe, you rummy buzzard," on an unused disk sector, which is definitely a joke message left by one of the programmers in the beta version, but it was accidentally included in the production version. My father had a, and I quote, Packard Bell 35 CD 486 enhanced to 586. Now in 1986, Benny Allergen, Larry Metz, and a group of other Israeli investors bought the American former radio and television set brand from Teledyne and resurrected it as a manufacturer of low-cost personal computers. Their computers were among the first IBM PC compatibles sold in retail chains such as Sears. Additionally, it had less than a gigabyte of space. Comparatively, my iPhone 6S Plus has 64 gigabytes of space on it. His computer had a 66 megahertz speed. Here's another comparison for you. My computer has a 3.5 gigahertz processor, meaning I have roughly 53 times the computer power that computer did. Additionally, it had a CD-ROM, but also in 3.5 and 5.25 floppy disks, which at this point were done away with. Now here's one I thought about. About those big, bulky, ugly Motorola cell phones. I mean, just look at them. Ugh. Why are the numbers on the outside? Is this advertisement asking you to be on the phone and drive? Anyway, before I lose my mind, let's move on to some of the gamers of the era. That's what this channel is known for, right? Let's talk about Frogger. According to the 1981 issue of the Computer and Video Games magazine, which reviewed the arcade game in 1981, they called it one of the most popular new generation of arcade games, which is getting away from space themes. Everyone in my family has had an experience with the game, which in my eyes is definitely a highlight because nowadays there's so many games that no one has played the same thing. In other news of 1980s video game hits, we have Pac-Man. Pac-Man was one of the highest grossing video games of the decade. It was an instant hit due to its simplicity, but also holding a challenge for the more skillful, or perhaps having enough time on their hands. My father states that his favorite game in the 80s was a game called Conan. It was for the Apple II, which was a new computer at the time. In this game, the player controls Arnold Schwarzenegger as the muscle-bound warrior in his new costume for the movie Conan the Destroyer. Despite attempting to make the two connected, the game has little to do with the movie. The idea of the game is that Conan attacks an evil man named Volta in his castle fortress. Conan is armed with 10 boomerang swords. From time to time, Conan may be aided by an avian ally, as he attempts to defeat Volta's sinister hordes, which included bats, scorpions, giant ants, fire-breathing dragons, and floating eyeballs. In the game, Conan does not jump, he somersaults. If he falls, he launches into a dive. Conan includes 7 diverse levels requiring the player to navigate lava pits, geysers, spike pits, and floating platforms. Along the way, the player often needs to collect magic gems or keys in order to progress. If somehow you haven't heard of those 1980s video game hits, at some point you've definitely heard about Dungeons & Dragons. My father was known as bringing a recorder with sounds and effects to add music to the atmosphere and help with storytelling abilities, which may be reminiscent of the series Critical Role on YouTube. It only just clicked for me because I remember Matt Mercer and the celebrity guests like The Rock and Vin Diesel. If I recall, my grandfather remembers his character even to this day. It was a ranger who was named after President Bush, but in reverse, so like, Sub? I guess, like, it's H-S-U-B, I guess. I don't know. I didn't ask for pronunciation. Regardless, let that serve as a point of how popular this game was. Its tabletop design is timeless, which allowed it to prosper all this time. There was even controversy over a few character types in one of the books having exposed breasts, and the idea of kids gathering around the table of the book makes it inherently satanic for some reason. I don't know what was going on then. Moving on to the movies in the 1980s decade, we're starting with the Missing in Action movie with Chuck Norris. This is probably the best stories I have related to movies because while my dad was living in California, he went up to see Chuck Norris's house in Palos Verdes. When he arrived and asked to see Chuck Norris, it was his wife who answered the door, and they wound up in conversation. In doing so, my father learned that Chuck Norris was out filming Missing in Action 2, which at the time was insider news, so of course he went and told who he could at school. And my grandfather, who was active in the Navy at the time, says that Chuck Norris had also taught basic CQC for the Navy. As for some of the other movies, none have as neat of a story, but they're definitely culture-defining moments that have stuck with my family. Just a mention of their name, and even people who never seen the movies go, oh yeah! For example, The Evil Dead. There's been more movies, shows, and spin-offs since, but its original release is what started that niche genre like a horror comedy. I believe this is a staple of Bruce Campbell's too. At this point, I could ask any of my friends if they've seen Evil Dead, and they would, tell me what they watched there. It's just that popular. Speaking of that horror genre of movies, Nightmare on Elm Street was also popular at the time, making Freddy Krueger a horror icon for decades to come. I've never really been in the movies, especially anything even close to horror, but these 1980s horror icons are still relevant to me. My dad many years ago had shown me that there was a song from Will Smith, or at the time The Fresh Prince, which was related to the movie. It was called Nightmare on My Street, which jump-started horrorcore rap for the years to come. The next movie still in the horror genre may be one of the most influential movies, which again I haven't personally watched yet, but once I found out it was released in the 1980s, it had to go on this list. The movie in question being Friday the 13th, another movie that has had countless spin-offs, books, and even video games, immortalizing the hockey mask as a horror icon. Whenever people are looking at their calendars and they see Friday even being around the 13th, they think about that date, which is only amplified by pulp culture and media. Outside of this horror genre, which had a boom in the 80s was also known for a string of successful action films and stars. These movies are still popular today, and so are their actors. Nowadays, movie critics and even normal people consider those old action movies to be bland and /or cheesy, but the truth is they were popular enough to stick with people for generations, and still have a large following a few decades later. First of the movies that comes to mind is Rambo with Sylvester Stallone, a movie which is now known for certain comedic inaccuracies as it still stands the test of time as an action movie for people to just sit down and enjoy. Following this trend, we have the Predator movie, which had a few actors who had a climb to fame, but most importantly was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Once I knew about him, I'd almost idolized him in a way for a while as a kid, even going as far as to attempt some kind of knockoff accent. It was good enough for people to know who I was impersonating, which means Arnold Schwarzenegger was popular enough to be memorable to them. Even today, he has a social media presence and acting roles in movies. Another 80s film that's definitely worth noting is the Terminator film that also really put his career in motion. It was a film so popular that it had a sequel in just the last few years. To this day, no one ever really forgets the Terminator. RoboCop was another film that was released in the 1980s, which is yet another case of being so popular that even generations to come know of RoboCop. Even if they've never seen it themselves, their parents or older siblings or even social media influencers on the likes of YouTube or Instagram still reference these staples of media. And this trend of action movies spawned what is the best Christmas movie of all time, wink wink, Die Hard. I've actually watched this movie, which is a surprise, seeing as how I barely watched any movies at all, especially on this list. I found it to be fun and captivating. To say that Die Hard isn't a staple of pop culture would most certainly be a lie. Another popular name that changed the lives of many is The Lord of the Rings. Be it the movies, books, spin-offs, video games, at some point, someone's life has crossed paths with The Lord of the Rings name. The movies were among the first to contain live-action characters right alongside animated CG characters, which was a big innovation at the time. Personally, I've put literal days of my life into the spin-off game that's actually more controversial than I thought. But I digress, that's unrelated. I can tell you that both my dad and my grandfather had enjoyed the trilogy of books, because when I brought it up, they went, "Oh yeah!" Which, as I mentioned before, is always a good sign that I got a good piece of 1980s culture. The premise of this involved me sitting down with my family and interviewing them on the 1980s decade. And my family, when I sat down and interviewed them, they weren't sure if the Smurfs or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were from the 80s, but from a quick search I found out that they were, meaning I can talk about my dad's vintage Smurfs pillowcase. Here it is. And the fact that my grandmother says my grandfather has the head of one of those turtles. Even today, the 80s cartoons are getting screen time and their sequels are still going strong for what seems to be generations to come. Keanu Reeves was always popular, but he's recently had a big popularity spike with the new generation of kids coming of age. Getting roles in video games and hit movies like John Wick, but this is all thanks to where he started in acting with roles like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and other roles to follow. After looking at some clips of the Bill and Ted movie, I realized how hilariously 80s it was. Had the movie come out now, critics over the world would have cried. I grew up with a video game that had Kiefer Sutherland in it, so I was surprised to see his popularity stem from some of the roles that started his career back in the 80s, like this. I've not heard of the movie myself, but just a small clip of it seemed quite interesting. My grandmother recalls seeing it herself too. Moving on from the movies into the music of the era, it is no doubt that music affected media and pop culture forever. If I mention 80s music, so much can come into people's minds. Even just earlier I mentioned the Fresh Prince and DJ Jazzy Jeff's music, but there were others like Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch. Yep, that's right, that is Mark Wahlberg. Can't tell him that though, he doesn't like his music career. My grandfather recalls being among the first to see Van Halen and watching them perform Jump early on in their career while in California with the family. It's very interesting to hear about how they watch and witness these pop culture giants rise to fame. Similarly, they went to a concert for the Pointer Sisters, and before the Pointer Sisters were to go on, none other than Madonna had a performance where she was booed off stage, to which my grandparents mentioned. That seemed to have stuck with them, and I personally find it very surprising after knowing she turned into a pop star and a media icon herself. This isn't directly music, but it's definitely related. My dad told me this, and I was in a state of belief and belief at the same time. Like, I imagined it existed, but having proof it existed was too much to comprehend, apparently. There really was rap battles and dance battles. There was people walking on sidewalks with boom boxes, Walkmans, and the cardboard, like, sheets and stuff like that, searching for a worthy challenger like it was some kind of warrior 1,000 years ago. At this point, TV was already established, but music TV, MTV, was born in the 80s. Back then, it was all music and music videos. The intermissions were still whatever kind of commercials, of course, but the host kept you up to date on the music news, too. Coming away from the historical phenom that was the 1980s pop culture, we have politics of the age, which is nothing to ignore either. Ronald Reagan was president. He was one deemed responsible for the end of the Cold War, followed by the fall of the Berlin Wall. Being one of the few presidents who were also actors, he had the term Reaganomics coined after him. He had 2 assassination attempts, one where he was wounded and another where he was safely protected at the cost of his Secret Service members.
For an open world.
I personally remember him from this video, which is still the coolest thing I'll never forget about a president.
That have marked the history of this city. America missed me.
And in a way, he still has a media presence, seeing as how he was in the newest Call of Duty title, which is a video game giant and a social media giant as a whole. Family closely remembers the catastrophe that was the failure of the NASA Challenger shuttle. They were watching the broadcast when it first went down. One of the women that was on board the NASA Challenger was a teacher from nearby, in Elmira, New York nonetheless. This teacher had big plans to become an astronaut and teach aboard the shuttle. However, this accident was caused by a faulty O-ring, which is such a small and particular issue, and that led to the fatality of every crew member on board. The issue was that the weather was not optimal and NASA still went ahead with launch. If the weather was worse enough that NASA hadn't done that, they may have seen the faulty O-ring and they may have still been alive. When the Challenger exploded in the air and fell from the sky to the ocean side, were presumed and officially confirmed as dead thereafter. According to my family, that was on the TV news channels and stuff like that. Even things as old as 1980s CNN was covering it. During this time, when the NASA Challenger went up, the footage was cut and the broadcasts were cut off and everything else like that. However, in recent memory, I recall finding a YouTube video when I searched this up where there was unreleased footage of the rest of the failure of the NASA Challenger shuttle, and it pretty much kept the recording going until that hit the water. And that is definitely more than most other broadcasts have seen, and it was an eye-opening experience even for me. The comment section of that video, which is going to be cited in the description, is actually pretty, like, you know, in a way cool, but it's not really, like, you know, something that's good. But it was really cool to see people coming over and typing how they felt at the time, or even how their parents felt, or whatever. And I think that that's pretty cool that there is a way to be able to find a common ground and you know, share your thoughts like that. But I digress. Let's move on to Chernobyl, another accident that occurred in the 1980s. I have a video on my channel covering it in greater detail, but a shorter than 11-minute way of saying it is that there was a failure on the side of poor judgment. Chernobyl's nuclear power plant was working fine until the employees wished to try and run an experiment, taking away most of the security measures and running it at a much lower power. However, things turned for the worse when the pressure became too much and blew the reactor open, causing a major meltdown. This is the home of the elephant's foot that was hot enough to melt through multiple floors. Just being close to it could kill you in minutes, even decades after the fact. Due to this high radioactivity, it is also hot enough to still burn whatever comes in contact with it, making it very hard to contain. At this point in time, the Chernobyl area is open to tourism in small doses, but there are safety limits in place to keep people safe. At the time of the accident, the Soviets tried to cover it up until literally all of the surrounding nations were pointing fingers saying that something must have went wrong. Nearby, there were families being sent to other countries as to try and make them someone else's responsibility. My grandfather taught a class of students, and a couple of them were from Belarus. They were sent to America in light of the accident. They seemed unaffected and are happily very successful now, save their youngest sibling who was developmentally affected physically and mentally later in life due to radiation. This project is my longest, most ambitious project yet, and after some procrastination and life doing life things, I'm able to finally finish it and present it to my class, my friends, and family on this channel. If you guys did enjoy, leave a like. If you didn't like it, leave a dislike. Comment down below whether you liked or disliked it and why. Make sure to check the description for all my sources and, you know, the full YouTube videos and anything else you may be looking for. If you enjoyed this content, you can subscribe and hit the notification bell, and then you can pick and choose the content you want. If it's just my projects or whatever, or if you actually decide to check out some of my other content, I have to leave the warning here that some of that content is stated as explicit. I'm an 18-year adult, I'm entitled to my freedom of speech, and there is definitely some inappropriate language for those at younger ages. You know, some of my games contain lots of fighting and shooting and stuff like that, and it's just something that I need to make sure that people from my school are, you know, aware of before they go and watch it and be like, oh my god, Jake, no. Peace out, guys. Hope you guys have a good day.